Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and tonight I'm joined by Vincent Duitsch and also all the way from Buenos Aires, Santi Bauzá.
Hi guys, it's also a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and let's have some fun.
Yeah, this is going to be a really fun episode. It's one that I've been looking forward to for quite a while now, and I'm glad that we finally got you onto the podcast. So just before we kick things off, Santi, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Right now I'm basically a journalist. I've studied communication back home in Buenos Aires. This is where I am right now. And for a while I've been doing different gigs, both written and also kind of audiovisual stuff. I've been on a few Copa 90 documentaries, which they filmed here. I was for when Boca and River faced each other in the Copa Libertadores final back in 2018. I was for the qualifiers for the 2018 World Cup as well, and for the 2017 Libertadores final as well. And for the last 2 years, I've been working for the La Nación newspaper here in Argentina. I've been writing for them. Unfortunately, my job has actually allowed me to go to a few games, to cover a few matches. I've been able to travel a lot. I've been recently to the Under-20 World Cup here in Argentina. I've covered the national team as well. So I'm really glad. I mean, for all the stuff that I've done so far, since I'm only 24 actually. So.
No, that's brilliant. I mean, I've said it before in this show, but if you do what you love, you'll never work on a day in your life, and you're a testament to that. But also Vincent, our other guest who's been on the podcast before, he's also testament to that, but it's not really a day job for him. It's a full-time hobby, I suppose. But Vincent, of course, is the same with how much he travels, going to different matches and grounds, experiencing different cultures, and ultimately seeing a bit of the world and all that.
I'm actually jealous of Santi here because he is from Argentina, of course, and that passion, those hinchadas, the support, is the best in the world. Like I went to Racing Club against Independiente last October, last October. So I want to ask you, Santi, it was 0-2. How was that for you? How did you live that game? Because I was in the Racing end, and it was insane. For me, it was insane. Just the atmosphere. It was nothing like I've ever experienced, but for you as an Independiente supporter, like you just told us, you won that game. How was that for you?
Well, actually, though, you know that there are no away fans in Argentina, unfortunately. That's how it's been for the last 10 years because of some fan violence. And also because, over the years, I think there's been something of an economic factor because big clubs realized that they could fill whole stadiums by themselves, so they realize they don't need away support. So I feel like the return of away fans seems harder and harder as the years go by. So I couldn't, of course, go to the game. I watched it at work, but it was a great feeling because Independiente actually played a really, really, really great game back then. It was a tough fixture as well as most other derbies are. But they did exactly what they needed to do. They were very solid in defense, and they were very, very dangerous every time they got the ball and tried to find spaces on the counter. And that's how they found both of the goals. And it was a very, very solid performance from an Independiente side, which, by the way, halfway through last year, they were actually flirting with relegation, which was seriously concerning, especially for a club as big as Independiente and one which only got relegated less than a bit more than 10 years ago for the first time ever. So fortunately, Independiente were able to get out of that mess, and that derby win was one of the kind of turning points of the season.
Fair enough. And if I'm correct, correct me if I'm wrong, but just to I don't know the word, but just to say how big the club Independiente is, you won the Copa Libertadores like 7 times, right?
Yeah, Independiente are the team that have won the most Copa Libertadores with 7, one more than Boca. But actually, not only have they last won the Copa Libertadores 40 years ago, but in the last 30 years, Independiente have only been at the Copa Libertadores 3 times.
Really?
Yeah. So it's been some really, really, really rough time for Independiente, almost throughout my lifetime.
No away. I know about the away supporters ban, of course, but last time I was there, I did see some away supporters, but it was probably the board and family members, I think.
Yeah, that seems to be the most likely scenario. I mean, there are some games, mostly within other provinces like Rosario and Mendoza and Santiago del Estero, in which some away support is allowed, mostly because it's from small clubs and from other provinces which are more lenient when it comes to away supports. But when it comes to games in Buenos Aires, that is strictly forbidden. So it must have been some board members and families and stuff.
Yeah. I've been, of course, I've been to many games in Buenos Aires. When I was there, I went to a Droog Brown against Chacarita as well. And at one time we were in the, I don't know if you know do you know the stadium of Droog Brown?
I've never been there, but yeah, I've seen pictures. I'm not exactly familiar with it, but I kind of know where it is. I kind of know what it's like.
So it's not that big. It's just like a family club, and we were on the stand there, and suddenly there were like 100 guys. I was like, yeah, you guys are not from here, and it turned out they were away supporters from Chacarita, which were going for promotion at the time, as you know. And like in after the 45th minute, the police came. They had just arrested them. Like, you're not welcome here.
Yeah, we'll definitely chat about Vincent's trip later on, because it's a great way to wrap up the episode, and Vincent, that's ultimately the reason that you wanted to join in this one, so that you could talk about your trip to Argentina, which, as you mentioned, was just in October there. But until then, we're going to be talking about a defunct Argentine club called Sportivo Palermo. Pretty elusive club compared to some of the other ones we've talked about on this show. Obviously, the first thing that jumped out to me was their name, Palermo, which to me initially suggested a link to Palermo in Sicily. Of course, there's a strong connection between Italian migration and football clubs in Argentina, so I don't think that's entirely out with the realms of possibility, but without knowing much more, it's difficult to say if that's where they got their name from. They were founded on the 18th of May 1908, so still comparatively early in terms of Argentine football history, and they were based in the neighbourhood of Palermo in Buenos Aires. Now, the name of this neighbourhood does have links to Italy, so that's interesting in itself. So, I'd argue there probably is a pretty strong case there to say that that's why they were named Palermo. But early on in their existence, Sportivo Palermo actually mixed with a club called Atlas Club, who by all accounts, Santi, were a pretty decent amateur outfit themselves.
Yeah, apparently they have nothing to do with the current club called Atlas, which they currently play in the 4th division, and Light Blue, they don't have anything to do with them. But as I've been looking, of course, into Sportivo Palermo ahead of this episode, apparently this was kind of a way to try and get together with several smaller clubs from the neighborhood of Palermo, which, by the way, it's a pretty big neighborhood, and right now it's a very kind of a bohemian or kind of hipster neighborhood right now in Buenos Aires. So back then, most clubs that were founded in the early 20th century, in contrast to the ones founded in the late 19th century, which were mostly founded by railroad workers and immigrants from the UK. These clubs from the early 20th century were founded mostly by people from the neighborhoods and people who were like trying to find some activities to do around the neighborhoods. Most of them were really, really small and really humble. And in this case, which it was a very common practice around clubs in small clubs in neighborhoods, to try to get together to try and unify their supports and unify their kind of activities for one club. It's not exactly a case of whether these clubs are big or well-known. It's like they were trying to get together to try and, increase their support within the neighborhood.
Exactly that. So, yeah, I suppose it's a way to pool resources, for one. And if you're based in quite a large neighbourhood, then it probably makes more sense to have one club instead of two, so you're not dividing fan bases and stuff like that. Saw a lot in Scotland, of course, in the early days of football there, and when football started to grow and more people sort of started going a little further afield to support the larger teams that would emerge, such as Celtic, Rangers, even Queen's Park and eventually Partick Thistle, then you saw other clubs become absorbed or basically just folding because they didn't have the membership that they really wanted. So it makes sense, and it was quite common during the early years of football in different countries. They stayed amateur for a pretty long time, to be honest, and their original ground was called the Caceros, if I'm right in saying. I'm guessing that playing field is now long gone.
Try to look at the places in which Sportivo Palermo have been playing throughout the history, because despite the fact that they're called Sportivo Palermo, they have not always been playing in Palermo. Actually, they played even outside the realms of like the capital of Buenos Aires. which is where they were founded, of course. But seeing that they have been throughout their history a very, very small club and they've struggled to find a home, it seems like in most cases they have been playing in places which right now they don't exist. Maybe when you read into their history, it reads kind of like regions in which they play, but not like exact stadiums or pitches in which they play. They actually struggle to find a home for like the 50s and the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah, they kind of climbed the divisions pretty quickly in their early history, but I think we've touched on it before in the podcast. The league system in Argentina can be pretty complicated, and not just today in 2024, but throughout history as well. Have you any idea, Santi, what level this would have been compared to how the AFA and the leagues are structured now?
Well, I mean, there's been so many changes. Consider the fact that during the glory days of Sportivo Palermo, which I'm sure you will eventually get into, which was in the 1920s, football wasn't still 100% professional in Buenos Aires. That wouldn't happen until 1930, 1931. So you can imagine that there were a lot of different, formats throughout history and with the tournaments and stuff. So when we're talking about the Intermedia back then, I think we're referring to the second division, or kind of like a bridge between the second and the first division. I mean, things are completely different right now. I'm sure you will eventually get into it, but
to ask you about a bit later on is the current setup within the AFA, because there's been a number of changes over the last few years, and it seems mad, but we'll come on to that a bit later on. But as you say, Sportivo Palermo kind of started having their glory days around this sort of period of time when professionalism was slowly making its way into football in Argentina, but it just wasn't quite there yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so in the 1920s they did manage to reach the top tier, but interestingly they also merged again with another club called Eureka. And I know I'm using this word merged or merger, but to me it almost seemed as if they're actually absorbing them instead, and kind of bringing other clubs under their fold as they rocket through the leagues. Eureka themselves went around an awful long time. Are they a club that you're familiar with at all?
Yeah. Actually, they were absorbed by Sportivo Belgrano, which you will see throughout the history that Sportivo Palermo had a lot of mergers and tried to survive by getting together with a lot of clubs throughout their history. And in all of those cases, they just absorbed them. They always kept their identity. They always kept their own colors, their own name, absorbed the clubs they were merging with.
I think that's one of the reasons why I found them so interesting, to be honest. It's not so much that they merged and created new clubs, but as you said, because they absorbed other clubs and kept adding to this massive pile of resource almost that they were kind of trying to create. I don't know, it was quite a strange one. I can only assume that the other clubs were from Palermo or surrounding neighbourhoods as well, but it seems strange to me that none of these clubs put up a fight or tried to have their identities implemented within the new club. And I suppose in a lot of ways I found it quite strange that Sportivo Palermo were always the club who kept their colours, their badge, their identity, and so on and so forth. It just seemed a bit strange to me.
I mean, it is a weird one. Actually, it might have been kind of their own way to try and get into the first division, because when the merger happened, they were still in the Intermedia, and Eureka occupying that spot in the first division. That's how they got the promotion.
Right, I see. So basically, they absorbed Eureka and took their spot in the league as a way to get to the first tier. Okay. I mean, it's certainly an interesting way to go about it, I think, it has to be said. But really fascinating nonetheless, to be honest. And as you said off air, Santi, it's something that was actually more common in Mexico than Argentina. So, I don't know, maybe the Palermo hierarchy got some ideas from there. Definitely an interesting one to look into, though. I'd like to research that a little bit further. But they finished 10th in their first season in the top flight and also suffered the worst defeat of that season, losing 6-0 away to Sportivo Almagro, another club who I believe don't exist in their original form anymore.
There is an Almagro right now, but I don't know if it's the same club. Actually, Almagro are a club that's pretty well supported. They play in the second division. They last played in the first division in, I think, 2005, something like that.
Okay, so they're not related to the Sportivo Almagro that we've just spoken about there. Okay, got you. Well, at this point, things start to get a little bit messier, as there's essentially a split in the league systems, and you end up with the AFA and the AAMF, I think it was. And Sportivo, Almagro and Lanús actually left the AFA mid-season to join the AAMF. So now, there's lots of examples of this happening all over the world. Scotland, of course, is the one that I'll always come back to because that's the one that I know the most about. It happened in England as well, and probably other countries too. All for different reasons, of course. But what was the reason behind the split in Argentina?
Yeah, back then there were two separate associations. There were a lot of debate. There was a lot of debates around professionalism at the clubs were more supportive of it. Others were not. Actually, some of the most successful clubs in the amateur era folded because not because of something about not being able to cope with professionalism, but because they were flat out against it. So there was a lot of debate back then. There was a lot of disorganization, which, I mean, there's still a lot of debates whether the titles won by current professional clubs during the amateur years should still be counted because things were so messy back then. There's the debate that things are also messy right now. So
yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah, I mean, I've got a few questions for you later about the FA's current format and the plans to change that again, so we'll definitely come on to that. In terms of Sportivo Palermo, they entered, I guess, what would be classed as their golden era at this point in the 1920s. You also see a lot of what you would maybe call traditional or historic clubs from Argentina begin to emerge in the new league systems, like Platense, for example. Then in 1922, they came close to winning the title themselves, but sadly lost out to Hurahan, another historic club. That was only by 3 points, so pretty hard going for them. That was their peak, not to be completely honest, that was their peak. But interestingly though, this was the season when they moved back to the neighbourhood of Palermo, which you can only assume was a huge factor in their eventual push for the title.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they went back to their roots. They went to the place where they were founded in the first place. So
yeah, exactly. But sadly, the season after, they dropped right down the table to 16th in what at that point was now a 23-team league. So it's already becoming quite populated. And I think before that, there was only 11 clubs or something in the league. So that's a pretty significant jump. I mean, you can tell that the game in Argentina has certainly grown at this point, which is great. But, you know, everyone's just kind of being thrown into the same league by is what it seemed to me anyway.
Just for a laugh, can you explain the promotion and relegation system in Argentina right now?
Oh. So, okay. So you have two ways in which you can get relegated from the first division in Argentina. And it's only been like this since last year. So for the last 40 years, ever since San Lorenzo first got relegated in 1981, which was a huge shock, as it was the first time a Grande, one of the 5 big teams from Argentina, got relegated. They devised a system in which you would get the aggregated results of your last 3 seasons, and based on that, the worst teams from those aggregated results from the last 3 seasons, what we call promedios, only those teams would be relegated. However, since this was a system designed to favor the big teams still got relegated. So you got Racing relegated in 1983, then River in 2011, and Independiente in 2013. So it felt like, despite the system being devised to try to protect the big clubs were still so bad and so mediocre for so long, they still got relegated. So last year, you got one relegation spot through that system, and then another one which was like a regular league format. So the worst team from this year would be relegated this time. So at the start of the season, there were supposed to be 4 relegation spots, 2 for one format and 2 for the other. And then at the beginning of the season, one of the relegation spots was stricken out because of a request from other clubs. And then as the season progressed, and then clubs like Vélez and Huracán and Colón, like historic clubs, Gimnasia as well, they were faced by the prospect of relegation through being one of the worst teams of the year. Another relegation spot was also taken in the middle of the season. Despite having started the season with 4 relegation spots, now we only got 2, which meant that the league would still have 28 teams by the end of it. So at the end of the years, only 1 team was relegated through the old formats with the aggregated results, which was Arsenal. And then another team got relegated by being the worst team of the year, which was Colón, who actually had to play for exactly that Arsenal. Nothing to do with the London club, nothing to do with it. And another team, which was Colón, was relegated by being the worst team of the year, which was actually settled through a playoff against Gimnasia, which got the same number of points as Colón, which was quite an exciting kind of way to decide what team gets relegated. But it was like the first time in ages that it was like that. There was like a normal league. So yeah, it's a doozy. Yeah.
It's incredible, and I think the reason that there ended up being a split and two leagues formed was because one wanted to be like a completely closed shop, no promotion, no relegation, no other leagues, nothing. Where there's just nothing. It's it's just a league and that's it every season, which is a bit boring. But I can imagine that the league at that point, going from 11 teams to 23, obviously shows how much football has grown in Argentina at that time and how many more teams are being accepted into the leagues. But, it kind of stabilized briefly and, well, I don't know if it's ever really been stable, to be honest. It's the the rules and relegation settings and things have always kind of been nuts, to be honest. And that was reflected in the 1920s as well, as Palermo switched between the AFA and the AAMF 2 or 3 times, which is also crazy. And for the rest of the 20s, to be honest, they were pretty mediocre, so they didn't do very much, to be honest. I mean, they literally didn't do anything worth noting. But then in 1927, the two leagues merged, and in my opinion, Santi, this wasn't so much a concession from one that the other had succeeded or failed, but just kind of how things were at the time, and what was reflecting the landscape of how clubs were growing. Would you agree?
I think it's kind of the way it was, because I mean, as we all know, then the AFA would eventually become the winners actually of that argument, kind of like what happened with the basketball leagues in the US back in the 60s and 70s. So I think it was more of a case of depending on where they would be able to be registered, on how many slots there were available. I think it's more of that instead of like in terms of supremacy or the level of those teams.
Okay, yeah, I understand. Well, in 1927, the Primera Division emerged, and in the first format, there were 34 clubs, which is huge. But there was also no relegation, so there weren't really any repercussions for the clubs who finished bottom, as far as I'm aware. But then in 1928, they expanded the league again to a whopping 36 clubs, who thankfully only played each other once, and this year they also introduced relegation. But a weird quirk of that was that the league founders were exempt from being relegated, which is one way to give an advantage to your favourite clubs, I suppose. Still quite... It was kind of common though, and I think it's... So in Scotland you had election and re-election to the league at one point, and then when they restructured, sometimes they would... they would stop relegation. So I think it was maybe the late 80s, early 90s, where Aberdeen actually got saved from relegation because of a league restructure, and they didn't end up going down. And I think there is quite a big perception that these reconstructions always happen when a big team is really, really struggling. So it kind of maybe looks quite bad. Could have just been down to league reconstruction. I'm not too sure. But also, it could be because they just didn't want their big clubs out of the league. But this wasn't so much a reconstruction as it was a lifeline for bigger clubs, I think, in my opinion anyway. As it pretty much became AFA law that one of these clubs couldn't be relegated unless they finished in a relegation spot twice in a row. So it's almost like a second chance, but that also didn't apply to clubs who played in the AFA and who were exempt from relegation altogether. So it's absolutely mad, but at the end of the day, it's one of those interesting nuances of football that's still in its early development and of a league still trying to find its feet. I mean, I can appreciate, I'd imagine the majority, if not maybe all of these clubs are from Buenos Aires that played in this league. Of course, having to travel across the entirety of Argentina to play some of these clubs in a 36-team league would have bankrupted a lot of these teams, but it still seems quite unfair in a lot of clubs that effectively a select few weren't able to get relegated.
I think it's long over. That's kind of thinking. I think it has to do with the fact that back then, as professionalism dawned, it was also the power structure around, the clubs and the league began to take shape, and that's how we got the Big Five. Like they're not the Big Five because they were the most successful, not just because of that, but also because in the beginning of the league, they also had a veto power. Boca, River, Independiente, Racing, and San Lorenzo, they had veto power when it came to making decisions when it comes to the format of the tournaments in the AFA. Having said that, I feel like that change I told you about when it comes to relegation, there was devised to try and protect the big clubs. It was kind of a way of them to try to flex their muscles and show that they still felt like they were entitled to keep playing in the league despite being as big as they are and despite having a poor season. Like they were trying to argue that having a poor season wasn't enough of a reason for them to get relegated. So even if it's not as transparently kind of entitled as it was back then, there's still a feeling of entitlement through these kind of decisions, like by striking one relegation, try to like argue in favor of like not being relegated for this or that reason.
Well, reconstruction continued in 1929, and at this stage the league was in a bit of a mess, really. There was loads of games were abandoned. Hurahan chose not to finish their season. They basically got to the last 4 matches and said, nah, we're not doing it. And there was also pockets of crowd trouble starting to bubble underneath all this as well during matches. So I suppose in a really loose way, things haven't really changed, have they?
Unfortunately, yeah. I think, but the thing where I would make the distinction is in the reason as why there were some violent episodes, because while I would argue that back then in the 20s and 30s and even in the like 60s up until the 70s or the 80s, there were episodes of violence because of this kind of support and this kind of like increased passion. I feel like from the 1980s onwards, it became all the more political because Barra Bravas, which would be kind of like our version, of course, of ultras. They're not ultras in the sense like Europeans, that they are like normal people, kind of organized to show the support for the team. They actually have political power. They are people who are linked to politicians from different parties, and they can bargain with the club presidents to make sure that these groups of people can have a free access onto the pitch, and they can have a free reign into dressing rooms and to speak to players. So I feel like violence became more and more kind of intrinsically linked to the political landscape of Argentina as the years went by, which was not the case in the 1920s. And I feel like it wasn't until the 80s when this began to happen. And I feel like that's like the current core of most conflicts around supports, I feel like in the 21st century especially.
I've experienced that firsthand. It's at Arsenal Sarandi, for example. I went there in the morning of Racing against Independiente. At 11 a.m. was Arsenal Sarandi against Defensa, if I'm correct. And we came across the main man of the Barra Bravas, and he was like, "Where are you guys from?" Hollanda. We had the tour guide with us, of course. And these guys are from the Netherlands. They're going to watch your club. And they were like, "Okay, you're me now." So we were invited by the leader of the Barra Bravas. We went to their clubhouse, and he just pulled out like this stack of ticket, like 5 centimeters of ticket, like, "Here's tickets for you guys. You're with me. You can do whatever, no problem." And to be honest, I know I've heard stories about Arsenal de Sarandi. They're not a big club. I can acknowledge that. I will acknowledge that. But it was one of the best matches I've been there, because it will go wrong. Everything is taken care of. So that was for me like, the director of the club is not the boss of the club. This guy is the boss of the club. Basically.
Believe it or not, Arsenal may be a small club, but for a long, long time, they were a very powerful club. Because, of course, they were founded by Julio Humberto Grondona, who was the president of the AFA for 35 years.
Yeah, I've heard.
Of course, and you will see his name. You've been to the clubhouse, so you will see his name and his photo everywhere in that stadium. Absolutely everywhere.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same at Barracas right now, right?
Yeah, Barraca Central, which, they're the club founded by Claudio Tapia, which is the current president of the AFA. And they had their own road into the first division through very, shady refereeing and small favors around. And, well, eventually they ended up winning a league title, a Copa Argentina, Copa Sudamericana. So eventually
it's all very honest.
Yeah. I don't think they will get as far as Arsenal, because Arsenal feels like they have despite being, benefited in these kind of terms, they also have a very strong fan base by themselves, which I don't think Barracas has as much. So we'll see how they perform, but they have already been looked at with a lot of suspicion, just like Arsenal throughout all these years. So we'll see what happens.
Well, for Sportivo Palermo in 1931, another split in the league happens with larger clubs like Boca, San Lorenzo and River, etc., splitting off and making their own professional league. Sportivo Palermo stayed with the AFA, and from this point on in their history, they basically just fizzle out into nothing, to be honest. They become a real non-entity. They demerged at one point and then absorbed another club, I think were called Atletico Palermo, and then they demerged again not long after that, so it was quite short-lived. They plied their trade in the lower divisions until 1983 when they eventually dissolved, and that was pretty much it for them, wasn't it?
Between the 4th and 5th divisions throughout the 60s and the 70s were never, for that time they struggled a lot to keep the support. I mean, the only supporters were still old people who were still, supporting the club from the early days, and that began to die out as they lost their home and they were forced to be playing at home in different kind of places around Buenos Aires. They also struggled to pay their own players. They actually went to a game with 10 players and no subs, I think. And they actually, in order to survive during the dictatorship between 1976 and 1983, they had to take a pretty big loan, which eventually couldn't pay back, and that was what led to the demise in 1983.
Of course, it's when we discuss football in Argentina around that period of time, you of course have to talk about the dictatorship at that point and the people who disappeared and football fans and footballers themselves and other people who were affected by that and I was going to ask a question, but as you said, it was the loan that they took out to get through the dictatorship years that eventually sunk them, unfortunately. But it seemed like they were on a bit of a kind of downward trajectory anyway. It's never a good sign when games without number of players that they need and they're slipping down the leagues and so on and so forth. But of course there were other football clubs and millions of other people who suffered through that time as well, which has to be stated, and we have to have that backdrop when we're discussing football in Argentina at that point. I mean, has any attempt ever been made to revive Sportivo Palermo, or are they basically just consigned to the history books now? I know they weren't necessarily a big club.
Yeah, I mean, you will see, some, Facebook pages and stuff. I feel like that's more kind of like descendants of former socios, former members of the club, to keep the memory of the club alive, but not a club exactly. And then I found something extremely weird, which I think it really does not have any kind of relation to this club. But I found that on Twitter, there's this account of a club called Sportivo Palermo, which play in blue as well. But the badge has nothing to do with the old Sportivo Palermo. They don't play in the dark blue shirts they used to wear. But they're a club from kind of like a virtual league founded by streamers.
Yeah,
which is really weird to me. I mean, it's got like all fake players with fake games and fake kind of statements to the media and all that kind of stuff.
It's called
it's extremely funny to me.
One Future Football or something, because I looked at them as well because I was like, oh right, there's like a kind of like maybe they're related to them or something like that. And then I went on it and I was like, what the fuck is going on here? And I was like, is this NFT or crypto thing? And I was like, no, like it's even weirder. Like it is honestly, it's very, very strange. Good luck to them and fair play to them. And one other thing that I wanted to ask was just how much of an Italian connection do you think there actually was with Sportivo Palermo, Santi? Because I mean, I did struggle to find much on it myself. But given the name of the neighbourhood they're from and the links that they have to Sicily and Palermo, I'd struggle to think that there wasn't some connection somewhere down the line, even if it wasn't Italian migrants who founded the club. They're named after, or they're based in the neighbourhood of Palermo, which, had links to Sicily. So, that's just something that I wanted to ask you.
I think there may be. There, in all likelihood, there may be, because you've got, as you said before, a lot of Italian immigration, a lot of Spanish immigration as well. But I feel like the reason why it may be called Palermo is because there was a lot of people from that part in Sicily, in Italy, which they eventually went to live there in that specific region, and then it grew into what it is today, which Palermo is kind of one of the most tourist friendly kind of destinations for in Buenos Aires right now. It's got a lot of fancy places to eat, a lot of places to watch live music as well. That's why I said it was kind of like a hipster / bohemian kind of place in Argentina, which I don't know if it has any kind of similarity with Palermo right now, like the actual Palermo. because I mean we're talking about kind of like a seaside destination, like the original Palermo, which this is clearly not. But anyway, it might be something related to that, to like you know, the early kind of immigrants from coming from that specific place in Italy.
Kind of jump on to the next part, I suppose, because we've spoken about Sportivo Palermo, and it's a really kind of interesting story of the amount of mergers that it went through, and we can talk a lot about identity and immigration and things like that alongside it. But I suppose it's kind of a question in two parts, Santi. We'll move on now to the second part, where we just kind of have a general discussion about other lost clubs from Argentina, good stories, and a little bit about football in Argentina now. But I suppose really, when you mention migration, obviously there's a large Scottish connection with football in Argentina through Alexander Watson Hutton, who is,
Yeah.
I don't know, is he known as the father of football in Argentina? Because I've seen loads of people say that he is, but I've never actually heard anyone say that he is, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think that would be like an accurate kind of statement, because I mean, after all, it was this man who actually founded the AFA in 1893. He was the man who kind of instituted the practice of football at schools, which was kind of something that makes the first stages of football and kind of codified football, which is quite similar to what happened in England, in the sense that it was first played at schools. And it was actually one of the clubs that was founded by Alexander Watson Hudson, which is called, I mean, back then it was called the Buenos Aires English High School, which is a school that still exists and which I actually attended.
Oh, really? Oh, that's
funnily
cool.
enough. It was my primary school, actually. So I mean, I have the Alexander Watson Hudson name ingrained in my mind because of that. So you can imagine.
Oh, that's awesome, really.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Amazing. I was just going to say that, you know, there was like St Andrews Football Club in Argentina and a number of others as well. And, you know,
Belgrano Athletic as well, which was kind of like the main rival of Alumni, which was, of course, the name that they eventually took when school names were banned by the AFA, and they could only use, you know, names related to the cities or to the places where they were founded, but not schools. They took the name Alumni, and back then they were a very successful club. They were one of the most storied and well, one of the biggest clubs actually in the pre-professional football period in Argentina. But as I alluded to before, they were one of the clubs who were opposed to playing professional football. So they played for the last time in 1911, and I think it was in 1913 that they eventually dissolved. And what happened with clubs like based on schools like Belgrano Athletic and Alumni is that eventually some descendants of those players, they actually founded rugby clubs, and they are now some of the biggest rugby clubs in Argentina. But when it comes to football, that's where their story ends.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, of course, all those earlier clubs as well, you know, whenever we talk about a country, there's always these early clubs that will be here, they'll lay the foundations, they'll be considered as some of the greatest and most historic clubs in the country, but they're no longer with us because, you know, different reasons. That's just what happens. So obviously there was all those clubs, and a number of those aren't around anymore. But I was wondering, because I had a look around and it was just a brief bit of research, you know, maybe didn't do enough digging. In the last maybe sort of 20, 30 years or so, have there been any really sort of big cases of clubs in Argentina just going bust and never coming back? You know, any kind of big scandals like that? Because it's difficult for me to find anything online. I just wondered if it's something that happens quite frequently or not.
It's not actually. I actually think that's funnily enough, Sportivo Belgrano has kind of a reputation for being the last club to be disaffiliated from the AFA, which was happened 40 years ago. And I think that is the case because there's this law in Argentina that kind of forces all clubs to be fan-owned, which does not allow clubs to be bankrupt, I think, as well, despite how many debts they have. Because, I mean, Racing actually came pretty close from going bust in 1999, Racing Club, and they were actually forced to be sold to a private kind of owner in order to survive. They had to be run by by an entrepreneur for a few years, which it's an object of mockery from Independiente fans since then. But because of that because of that scenario and because of how close Racing actually were from going bust, this law actually came out in which clubs could not go bankrupt because they realized how much importance they hold within their own communities and youth football as well, and to keep children away from starvation and poverty and stuff. Which, as it happens, this is a debate that has gone back now into the mainstream because of who is being elected as president right now is a libertarian who is now proposing that clubs should be owned by private companies. Something that's actually extremely unpopular here, and something that all clubs have voiced their opposition towards. So we're gonna see how that situation develops and whether fan ownership can still be the norm here in Argentina, even if admittedly there have been a lot of disadvantages when it comes to what can happen when political power gets into this systems of fan ownership, and political parties can take hold of clubs despite the fact that they should be fan owned. So
that's the thing. It's quite difficult to separate football clubs from politics in Argentina a lot of the time, and I know a lot of former politicians are presidents at clubs and do things like that as well, so it can be difficult. I did see that that debate had come back into the mainstream in Argentina. I think Brazil also recently passed a law saying that their clubs could be bought by outside investors as well. I mean, I would hope that the clubs stay fan-owned. I think you're absolutely spot on in what you say, that it's a good way to preserve identity and help people, that these things are anchors within their communities. And it should be kept as such, and it's fantastic that they were protected like that, and let's hope that it continues for a while longer.
Yeah, the thing with that is that has also allowed some terrible administrators to, let their clubs sink economically and in sporting terms because of that protection, which means that they cannot face any consequences because of that. I mean, they cannot, you have clubs that are mired in debt. I would actually cite Independiente as a big example of that, and they haven't had any kind of consequences when it comes to, points deductions, or actually transfer bans only a couple of times because of FIFA, but not because of Argentine football itself, which meant that some clubs have been extremely poorly administrated. So I feel like even if, this is of course a very flawed kind of system, one that needs several maybe amendments in order for this, in order to avoid this kind of things happening. I feel like letting clubs go into kind of private ownership would mean that this kind of disadvantages would be accelerated. So, it's a very tight line to walk,
Yeah, I'd agree with you in that, to be honest. There's always pros and cons to allowing new ownership models into any league, and new forms of ownership as well. But I'd always say you need to approach it with as much caution as you possibly can. Otherwise, you could be creating something which is set up for disaster and allowing some really malevolent elements into your football league, I think Brazil have recently allowed private ownership into their domestic league, and there's certainly been some interesting developments off the back of that. So, it's can only take it on a case-by-case basis, I suppose. But with all this, plus the potential of more reconstruction going on in the background, and we'll touch on that again shortly, I just wanted to ask, how is the domestic game in Argentina at the moment?
I think it's an interesting question because, I feel like there is no doubt that Argentina will keep producing some really talented players. Eventually, because this is such a big sport, and you will always find kind of great players will eventually rise through the youth ranks and then to the top of the game. But it feels like for the last 30-40 years, the top of the game has not been in Argentina. That has shifted quite heavily towards Europe, and it's not even in Argentina in terms of like South America, because as you said before, like the Brazil's relaxation of their own laws when it comes to ownership has led to some clubs actually going down with like the cases of Cruzeiro and Vasco da Gama and Santos, a lot of clubs struggling, but that has also meant that other clubs like Flamengo and Palmeiras have become so powerful in terms of economics and so successful that they can afford squads that really dwarf Argentina. I mean, Argentine clubs can still compete at an international level because the rest of the standard throughout the continent is still quite low when it's compared to Argentina, with a few specific exceptions. But I feel like the quality in football in Argentina has dropped a lot because you will see that clubs have gone down, well, kind of like what I've seen throughout the country in terms of the economic state and the misadministration of clubs as well, that has led to players being sold younger and younger and for less money than before. We've seen that right now with Claudio Echeverri, who should be at 17 years old, someone who should develop for at least 2 or 3 more years at River, but who is now being sold for peanuts to Manchester City. Only because
or that guy, that red-headed guy from Boca, I forgot his name, but he just got sold to
Valentin
Middlesbrough,
Barco.
correct?
Yeah,
Valentin Barco.
He's going to be, what is it, 10 million or something, the price is, which, I looked at that and I said, it's incredible how he's managing to leave for that amount of money. But on the other hand of it, I think it was Lannis sold Alexandro Bernabé to Celtic for 4.5 million.
Yeah.
And I have rated him. I just don't think he's been given enough of a chance. But there's a lot of people that were crying out at that fee. But I think the point is, you still need to pay a fair fee for these players. And I think, Santi, what you were trying to say is that if you want to progress the league and if you want the standard to increase, maybe slowly but steadily, you can't just keep selling youth for decreasing prices. So I want to know, is this exodus of young talent over to Europe one of the reasons the domestic game in Argentina has suffered and is suffering so much at the moment?
I feel like it is a big factor, but it's not the only one. Of course, you will have players who will be, the young players especially, who, immediately go to sign with an agent, and that agent begins to, whisper in their ear about, the riches and the glory of playing in Europe and the prospects of playing for the national team, which I think that is exactly what's going on with someone like Echeverri. But I feel like it has also come to a point in which if a player actually wants to develop as a footballer, they need to go to Europe because the pitches are better there, the coaching is better there, and the quality and standard of football are better there, which is something that you used to not. I mean, there used to be a lot more parity when it came to that in Argentina, especially in the 70s and 80s, when you would see, for example, that the Intercontinental Cup would be almost split between South American and European clubs. And even back then in the 2000s with a side like Boca, who were actually fighting side to side or even beating big clubs like Milan and Real Madrid, which it is something that just does not happen anymore because of that gulf in quality and coaching and that kind of standard of development.
Okay, so why is it then the standard of development isn't as high in Argentina? Is it a lack of investment for the AFA or even a lack of investment from the government? It's different levels, of course, but to me it doesn't sound too dissimilar to Scotland in many ways, where obviously the football and infrastructure for youth development in Argentina is far beyond that of Scotland's, as far as I'm aware anyway, but it's not too dissimilar, where it could be a lot better, and this is why a lot of young talents are ending up going overseas, basically, is because the standard in their own country isn't good enough.
I feel like there is, of course, that is as I said before, I think that is a factor. There is a reality that there's just not enough money in Argentina right now when it comes to investment in football and for clubs to invest in their own kind of sporting facilities. But also I feel like there's been a decrease in kind of like youth development and management. I mean, there's been a clear step back when it comes to that. When you look at the 90s, for example, you had someone, the project of Jose Peckerman, who was leading the Argentina youth sides to, 5 world titles and developing some of the greatest players Argentina has ever produced. And showing them a clear pathway through the under-17s, under-20s, and the national team, and none of them eventually starting in Europe season upon season. I mean, you can kind of see that in Argentina right now because, I mean, we're still developing good players, but they're leaving a lot earlier. They are leaving kind of underdeveloped, and they need that sort of extra time to go. And we're not selling kind of finished products to Europe anymore. We're selling like extremely young players, extremely inexperienced, who need this kind of extra time to develop. And it's become more and more difficult for those kind of clubs to keep their own talent and develop their own talent. They've been failing at it. Their own clubs, of course, are kind of also, I would say, neglecting that kind of youth development side because they only need the quick buck to keep going. And they're only focused on the players they can actually capitalize on. So it's kind of a vicious circle that I don't know. It's extremely difficult to stop unless you have very capable people who have their hearts in the right place, and we don't have a lot of those right now.
Yeah, it's it can very, very quickly go south and lead to, as you mentioned, this kind of steady decrease in quality and in money coming into clubs. I'll hand the spotlight over to Vincent because he's been waiting all episode. And I think it's only fair that we let him chat to you and ask you some questions about his time in Argentina when you went, or indeed, Santi, if you have any questions for Vincent as well.
So yeah, I actually what you guys were just talking about the youth development. From what I've seen, what you said, Santiago, they're not that keen on the youth because from what I experienced is they don't play for the win, they play not to lose for a lot. Is my experience.
Yeah, I think that would be a pretty accurate description. I feel like it's become so competitive, you know, in the reserves and the lower divisions when it comes to youth development that coaching is almost exclusively focused on trying to win their current tournament instead of, you know, focusing on what would be right to develop when it comes to, you know, specific skills or character. And when you only focus on winning and trying to, you know, neglect everything else when you come to the first division, to, you know, the senior kind of football, you feel underdeveloped. You feel like you're missing kind of clear key things to continue, you know, playing at the highest level.
Yeah, I don't really have much questions. I'd just like to talk about Argentinian football. So why do you think, why are the Argentinians so passionate about their football?
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer for me because, I mean, how can you explain something that you've been born with? You know, it's like second nature to me. I mean, it's always been in my life. I mean, since I was like 3 years old, I was told that I should support Independiente. That's the club my dad supported. It's not a choice either. You know, it's kind of the way things are. You know, so yeah. It's kind of like a chicken or egg kind of question because, I mean, it's been here for so long, and it's been I don't know, a way to keep oneself close to their own community, close to their own country, close to their own tradition, their own history, and of course, you know, it's kind of a way to, you know, look forward to the weekend. Especially in a country that's gone through so many hardships as this one as well. So there are a lot of different factors, and I feel like when you look at the scenes and the celebrations when Argentina won the World Cup at the end of 2022, you can see that's really encapsulated. You know, everyone. There were like 5.5 million people going to the streets of Buenos Aires to celebrate the World Cup victory, which is
I've been to the Obelisco and I was like, yeah, I've seen the pictures beforehand, of course. I was like, okay, that's a lot of people. But when I was there, I was like, okay, this is really big. It was even, yeah, if you haven't been there, you can't imagine how big the streets around the Obelisco are. 12 streets next to each other, and for like 2 kilometers or something. And that was filled with people.
Suppose that's actually a pretty fair question and a good question to ask as well, though. Santi, what is it actually like to see your country win the World Cup?
Look, for me, it was the first time. That time, because, I mean, back then it was 78 and 86. I was like, it was years before I was even born. And for people born in the 80s in Argentina, it was only 40 years of only just pure frustrations year after year, tournament after tournament, especially in the last 30 years when Argentina had won nothing, not even a single Copa America. When Argentina lost finals to Chile, lost finals in the last minute against Brazil, got trounced by Brazil in other occasions. There was all this kind of pent up frustration. That was an absolute release, and to do it in the way Argentina did it as well. Playing in the way they did against a country like France, which were the defending champions and who had another worldly player like Kylian Mbappe at his very, very, very best form, to do it the way they did it, and to do it also in the context of a country like this with such insane levels of inflation and political unrest and division as well. It was kind of like a release from all that. I mean, the first thing that I did once Gonzalo Montiel scored that winning penalty was, I just couldn't stop crying. I was actually working. Everyone was just jumping around a celebration, and all I could do was cry for like 10 minutes straight. It was extremely emotional to me, especially because I was the only one in that newsroom who had never seen Argentina win the World Cup before.
Oh wow, that's incredible. I'm not lying when I say that, and I don't think it's recency bias, because it's a year's past now. I think it's the best football match I've ever watched, and I'm not even kidding, because I think it is the greatest game that I've seen so far. And to be fair, I'm only going to be 28 next month, so but honestly, it was incredible. And I was back in Argentina just because I like Messi and I wanted Messi to win the World Cup. So
I want to ask you, Santi, like the saying goes, everyone in Argentina has a story about Maradona, a personal story about Maradona. Do you have one? And if so, what is it?
Well, Maradona, of course, retired 2 years before I was born. So when it comes to the football itself, I don't have like kind of a direct kind of encounter with Maradona. I didn't get that chance. But I will say that one of my very, very first gigs in journalism, I think, was recording a Copa 90 documentary about the comparisons between Messi and Maradona, which was, I think, in 2017. And it was a kind of an experience, a great experience for me, because it also got me the possibility of there was back then still a lot of debate on whether Messi could ever reach the kind of heights and the kind of adulation that Maradona, or the success actually that Maradona enjoyed with Argentina. There was still some skepticism, not from everyone, but from a certain group of people around Messi back then. And I got to watch the final game of qualification, the one that Argentina really needed to win in order to get into the Russia World Cup against Ecuador, at the home of the people from the Iglesia Maradoniana in Rosario, which was a really, really great experience. They are great guys. Of course, they were, as you can expect from people who literally created the Church of Maradona, they will have their own kind of side in that debate. But it was a great experience because, it was a game in which Messi was demanded to appear and to, show up for Argentina. And that is exactly what he did. He scored a hat trick in the game that Argentina desperately needed to win and got them into the World Cup, which, eventually it was an absolute disaster, but yeah, it was about that game. Look, I'm gonna be biased because, of course, Messi's the one I watched, and Messi's the one I grew up with, and Messi's the one that gave me the World Cup during my lifetime. So I will have to say Messi, because it's fair. And since he also won he won the World Cup, he won the Copa America, he won the Finalissima as well against Italy. It feels like these last couple of years he's been on a mission to try and kind of shut down any kind of debate or any kind of skepticism around his figure and what he means to the national team. And I feel like to do that after so many years of as I said before, skepticism and questioning and even insults from some of their own, that took a lot of mental strength and a lot of love for his own country, to never let them down, despite their country probably letting him down on several occasions which I feel like that's the biggest gift of all. The fact that he never gave up, the fact that he never actually, he always chose to play for Argentina when he could have just chosen to play for Spain and win a couple World Cups and a couple Euros if he wanted.
The emotion of Argentinian people as well. They think with their heart and not with their head sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was actually an occasion in which the Copa America was playing in Argentina in 2011. And this was right after Messi had won the Champions League and the league with Barcelona, like at the peak of the Guardiola era. Like, we will probably never see a Messi as brilliant as he was in that season. And he came back to Argentina to play at the Copa America. And that Argentina side was particularly poor. And there was this occasion in which he played at his home province in Santa Fe. Again, I think it was against Colombia, I think, which was, I think, a 1-1 draw. No, it wasn't against Colombia. There was the quarterfinals against Uruguay, in which Argentina drew 1-1 and then lost in penalties. And the whole stadium actually jeered Messi throughout the whole game in his own province in Rosario, which is kind of, significant. Like, there could be no turning point, and then 12 years later, he goes on and wins the World Cup.
It's a big
everything is given.
Statement to make at the time, and it's the perfect circle. It's the perfect sort of redemption arc, if you like. It's the perfect way for him to quieten all of those people who ever doubted him, because he went through those ups and downs. He kind of really briefly retired in a sort of heat of the moment decision, and then came back and showed everyone that he could do it again. And it was just it was fantastic, and it was absolutely incredible. And I'm sure, he will be very humbled at the next World Cup when Scotland win it and we manage to take the trophy. And I can fucking only dream, let's be honest. Never in my lifetime, I don't think, but you never know.
One more question left for Santi.
Go for it.
It's one of my favorite songs in Argentina. If I say to you, Rojo, mi buen amigo, what do you say?
Esta campaña volveremos a estar contigo.
Very good.
So actually, Independiente actually have a kind of a different, but with different, similar song, but with different lyrics, with that same tune,
Yeah. Sing it.
It goes, Rojo, yo te persigo, vos sos la sangre que a mí me mantiene vivo, cada domingo te vengo a ver, no importa si perdemos, yo voy a volver.
Yeah, I really need to get that course of Spanish down.
Amazing.
One of my favorite songs.
I'm chasing you. You are the blood that keeps me alive. Every Sunday I come to see you. It doesn't matter if we lose. I'm gonna come back. Something like that.
It's actually a kids song written by Jorge Videla.
Oh.
Bobby, mi buen amigo.
Oh, I mean, we did have a few songs like based on like political anthems and something like that, like the Marcha Peronista and the Marcha Radical and something like that, but I didn't know it came from actually, Videla.
Yeah, but so now you know. So for any listener, look up Bobby, mi buen amigo. Every Argentinian side, they have this song like Racing, mi buen amigo, Boca, mi buen amigo, River, mi buen amigo, Independiente, mi buen amigo, you name it, they all have this song. So if you want a little history about that song, look up Bobby, mi buen amigo.
I think that we sing song is the perfect way to wrap up this week's episode. Santi, thank you very much for coming on. You're welcome back on the podcast anytime. That was absolutely magnificent.
Once again, thank you very much for inviting me. I've also had a blast here, so it's been a pleasure, man.
No, it's been our pleasure, and as I said, you're welcome back on the podcast anytime. Thank you also to Vincent, who joined us in this episode to talk a little bit about his trip to Argentina back in October and to discuss Argentine fan culture a little bit with Santi as well. It was a really, really good chat, and I enjoyed listening into that. To all our listeners who tuned into this episode, thank you very much once again. If there's a topic that you want us to cover that's related to football history, heritage, identity, culture and community, all the stuff that we normally do, then please do get in touch. You can DM us at _footyheritage on X, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. You can also check out our website, which is footballheritage.co.uk, to see all of the fantastic written content that's being put out there by our contributors. But for now, Vincent, say goodbye.
Buenas noches.
Santi, say goodbye.
Good night, guys.
And it's a goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.